Hi, Lily. Thank you so much for being on the Werk podcast.
Hi, Lily.
Hello. So happy to be here with you both. It's really a pleasure to meet you. I'm excited for our conversation.
I'm excited.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to meet you because, I follow you on Instagram, but we were introduced, at least I was introduced to you by a mutual friend. So thank you, Miriam Ajayi, if you're listening to this. And we just really want to start from not maybe the beginning, but your origin story and you could start wherever you feel comfortable, your childhood, how you got into wellness, how you got into writing and your blog.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting when you reached out and you sent some questions before, which I always love. It helps so much. So I appreciate that. I was thinking about this distinction that we hold because I think fundamentally because of capitalism, around saying, well, okay, there's life and then there's wellness, and wellness is a lifestyle or or an industry. And for me, I'm not really interested in wellness as any or either of those things that are separate from our fundamental state of being. And, I don't think wellness is something you can sort of like opt into or commodify. And so for me, looking at wellness as a fundamental birthright that is also deeply connected to our relationship to the earth, I don't see a point in my life where it's like, oh, I started a wellness journey really. And I am super aware that a lot of that comes from a tremendous place of privilege because I was given that perspective and point of view through my upbringing and my experience and the knowledge and the wisdom that my parents passed on to me, and the place where I grew up, which was a place where I was able to forge a close relationship with the earth and really understand myself in larger connection to that ecosystem, and understand myself, as a human, like looking at, what is my place within my community, and that including the land and, the sky and the water and all of these different entities that comprise the bigger picture of what wellness is and how we can really be well in relationship to the planet that we live on. I grew up on Maui, and anytime I'm thinking of Maui or Hawaii, I think of the state motto, which is Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. That's in Olelo, Hawaii, or Native Hawaiian language. And it means, may the life of the land be perpetuated in righteousness. And I think that's something that is deeply interwoven into every part of life in Hawaii. Now, of course, that is subject, as we all are, unfortunately, to the strains of intense development in Hawaii, extremely extractive and exploitative tourism, plantation identity and culture, which is left over from, agricultural plantations of the late, 1800s into 1900s into early 2000s, 2010s. And the drive of all of that has moved the inherent wisdom of being earth connected that the Kanaka Maoli, the Native Hawaiian people, have, lived with for thousands of years on the Hawaiian Islands. The constant drive towards overdevelopment and capitalism has really superseded that in many ways and created the kinds of disconnection that we see so rampant in cultures all over the world that have been severed from that indigenous wisdom of place and of earth connectedness. So when I think about growing up in Maui, I kind of think about all of that at the same time. And so again, my understanding of wellness was really born there, out of my experience growing up there, and also out of my experience growing up with parents. My mom was an herbalist and an aromatherapist, and I learned very early on to sort of cultivate relationships with the earth and with plants as allies for me, and to understand myself again really in relationship to them rather than separate from them.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful.
Thank you thank you for weaving that all in, because Brittany and I definitely did want to ask you about your upbringing in Maui and how that affected your lens of the earth and of wellness and of what's kind of happening now with, and I've never been, I'm going next year for my cousin's wedding, but just when I think the pandemic hit, a lot of our community, Brittany and I share a community as well. We saw a lot of them moving to Hawaii and Maui to start these permaculture farms and be closer to the land, if you will. Maybe it was because it was in the United States, but it just felt, again, extractive and I don't know, wrong, but I didn't have the language at that time to understand why. And when I learned more about the colonialism that's still going on in Maui, and even the call to action from the locals to stop the tourism, and even I think the mayor or the governor asked the airlines to stop the flights coming in. But it's almost like that message doesn't get reached to the people that need to hear it. So can you speak about that and what's going on from a local lens?
Sure. Again, I said this just a moment before we started to record, but I can only speak for myself. I am, a white woman who grew up on occupied Native Hawaiian land. And so my perspective, I'm only speaking from the limited scope of understanding that I have. And so I can't speak for anyone else, but I think it has been deeply alarming to see, deeply alarming and also not at all surprising, right? Because we've seen this version of white-minded manifest destiny iterate itself over and over again on the land and on the bodies of indigenous people, and pristine places of beauty where that to a certain kind of mind are underdeveloped or waiting to be capitalized upon. And this idea that we just earlier this week went through the gauntlet, the yearly gauntlet of what was formerly Columbus Day and is now Indigenous Peoples Day. And so, being able to look at that, see that history, that gruesome history, look at how, in Hawaii, post colonial contact, post Captain Cook's arrival, within 50 years, 90% of the Native Hawaiian population was decimated. And so Hawaii is no stranger to plague, to disease, to pandemic. And the insistence of penetration and arrival, and sort of colonization, recolonization into Hawaii of largely white, privileged, very well-moneyed people fleeing the pandemic to come to the most isolated landmass in the world. And once again, wield their privilege, wield their money, wield their influence to take up land that could be used to otherwise feed local communities. Hawaii imports almost 90% of its food because the state has never invested in feeding its people. It's invested in tourism, and it's invested in plantation export agriculture in the form of sugarcane and pineapple. And nobody is living off of sugarcane or pineapple. And yes, there are, as you mentioned, there are small, sort of boutique farms and incredible farms. A lot of the work that I do in the community is around food equity and food sovereignty. And so I work with and am around a lot of people that are deeply invested in changing food systems here and are taking land, that is sort of community owned and producing thousands of pounds of food that is going out to community members and elders every month. And that, like, we need that times, 100 in every community around the islands. And it's starting to happen. But I'll tell you this story that was so horrifying to me in that like little window where we sort of thought the pandemic was over.
Yeah.
In like late spring, early summer. I went on the Bumble and I was like, okay, let me give this a try. And I swear like 70 to 80% of the guys that I was seeing on there had just moved to Maui or had moved in the last 6 months and wanted me to sort of, either be a tour guide or tell them, all the places they should go. And I was like, I'm not telling you shit. Like, I'm sorry. I don't know you. You think you somehow thought it was a good idea to move to the most isolated landmass on earth where, previously there was a very low rate of COVID during a pandemic. Anyway, against my better judgment, for whatever reason, I did meet a couple of these guys, and one of them, I met at a sort of like outdoor coffee shop place, and within the first 5 minutes of sitting down, he asked me, "So, what do you do in the tourism industry?" And I said, "I don't work in the tourism industry." And he said, "Well, isn't that the only thing there is to do here?"
Oh boy.
And I literally was like, my head almost exploded. And he proceeded to tell me that he had arrived on Maui, bought 2 cars, one for himself and one to put on Turo so that he could capitalize on this shortage of rental cars, an insane spike of, the rental car market. There was a period, and I think maybe still, where rental cars were going for like $500 a day or something.
Wow.
And so this white dude from the Midwest was like, "Oh, I know what I'll do. Like, I'm going to buy 2 cars and make just insane amounts of money off of the tourists who refuse to listen to people on Maui who are saying, we can barely afford to live here. We don't feel safe." I often like, I hesitate to say this, but a big part of why I am here in LA right now is because the intensity of what is happening on Maui around COVID right now is so strong that I don't feel safe there. Like, I don't feel super safe there. And a lot of that has to do with a anti-vax conflict that is happening. And that's a whole other conversation that is also super, super complex. But I think it's very telling that, myself and a lot of the people who I know, we don't, it feels uncomfortable to go to the grocery store. And naturally, that's the case for people everywhere coming, as we are still navigating this pandemic. Like, that is very real for a lot of people. And at the same time, there's a way in which, walking down the street and seeing the places that we would otherwise be able to move around freely, completely overcrowded with tourists, just it's insane.
Wow.
Can I ask you, Lily, when or how you began to recognize the disparities both in Hawaii and also just collectively in our world?
From the time I was really young, race in Hawaii, there have been so many think pieces about it over the past few years, and of course, over many, many decades. The sovereignty movement in Hawaii, the movement to, recognize Hawaii as an illegally occupied territory and an independent, sovereign nation that was overthrown by a cabal of American businessmen, is very strong. And that awareness, and because of the kind of, there's also a way in which America and many people want to paint Hawaii as a utopic melting pot. And that impulse comes from actually, largely from plantation culture, and from the fact that so many laborers were brought in from, places like the Philippines, China, Korea, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, and, Micronesia, as well as, other Polynesian countries, and meeting Native Hawaiian people on their land. And so because of that, the awareness and conversation and sort of self-consciousness or lack of self-consciousness around discussions of race in Hawaii is very different. And there's a lot of sort of self-identifying of racial and ethnic backgrounds that happens very early on. And I was aware of my whiteness very early on as a child, and of what that meant, of how that, meant that socially, my identity was not as valued as those with more melanated skin, but that economically, there was still a way in which my whiteness wielded power because of Hawaii's colonization. And so while obviously I was not having this level of conversation about that as like a 5-year-old, it was felt, and it was present from the time I was very young.
Wow. I just learned about I hope I'm saying it right. Hawaii? Is it like the instead of a W?
It depends. That's a linguistic thing that, it really depends who you talk to.
I'm sorry to all the native speakers if I'm saying it incorrectly, but
I'm sorry too.
Well, I just learned about this history recently through TikTok last year, and how the queen and the royal family was overthrown by the US, and how it's still kind of colonized and nobody talks about it. And I think it was that proliferation of people coming in that all of this started coming out, and I started learning about this. But even then, I believe at this point, with all of the technology, with all of the social media and all the resources out there, white-bodied folks do have the resources to learn, and they have the knowledge out there, and they have the resources to lean in. I guess just to like be very frank and honest, like how were you able to lean in and listen and do your own work?
Yeah, I think it's a gradual accrual. A lot of it, there are many aspects of it. There's the personal emotional element, especially growing up and just wanting to feel like I fit in and belonged, and wanting to, to be seen and liked, and also feeling very aware that my whiteness didn't do me any favors in that regard in the community where I grew up. And simultaneously then, as I got older, in college, studying the performance of race and gender and sexuality, and really starting to understand more from a theory perspective and from a historical perspective. And then, as I progressed into my work, I taught yoga for about 10 years full time, yoga, meditation, Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, and then had a pretty big break with that world, and kind of went in a different direction that was really just returning to my sort of core identity and calling as a writer, which has always been with me. I've always sort of been a writer first and foremost. And the impulse, I think, from that part of my life where, I was doing that spiritual work, and I only put it in quotations because I don't believe, again, same with wellness, like I don't think there's any separation of what is spiritual and what is not spiritual.
Yes.
Anywhere. And so but looking at that time, that the impulse that I had really was to work with people in a way that ensured liberation for all beings. And so as more and more became evident, clear, intense, fomented in the era, both pre-Trump and of course during Trump, I think my work in ultimately food and wellness during that time became much more focused on questions of okay, well, if the aim is for all beings to be free and all beings to be well, we've got to start really fucking basic. Mm-hmm. And that means ensuring that people have food, and that people are able to breathe and care for themselves, and that everyone has that fundamental right, that birthright, to be fed, to be well, to be cared for, to have access. And so starting to unpack all of that meant, of course, really looking at my own privilege. And I had also begun in 2009, I took a writing workshop masterclass with a brilliant author and activist, Rebecca Walker, who became a very dear friend and mentor, and teacher and collaborator. And she is a Black woman, and being able to cultivate that deep closeness, friendship, apprenticeship, menteeship, with her, learning from the, vast body of work that she had done, and also her lineage, her parents are Alice Walker and Mel Leventhal, who, were some of the first, if not the first interracial couple to marry after the Loving case, the historic Loving case.
I can't, those are her parents.
Yeah. And so stepping into that work, and which at first again was just, I was a student, and then became a friendship, and then became a collaboration. There naturally, or maybe not naturally, but I had a desire to do all the work that I needed to do on myself, in order to deeply understand what it meant to show up in those spaces, and to show up in conversation with her, and with then, ultimately, like we have a book that came out last year, and in doing our book tour, our virtual book tour, many of the people that we were in conversation with were just absolute, icons, and of the civil rights movement, of the current civil rights movement, and this deep, my sense of needing to simultaneously be able to show up with tremendous humility and a willingness to learn, but also to show up having done the work on myself, to understand what it means for me as a white woman to even be in these spaces, and why it's important, and at what point it is necessary to be able to speak, and at what point it's necessary to be able to just listen.
Are you finding in your work and in your day-to-day life that more people are showing up and doing the work? And I mean specifically more white bodied people, or are you finding that there's this hesitancy, without getting too far off track? We see a lot in spiritual and wellness spaces of spiritual bypassing, and really dangerous belief systems that harm the BIPOC communities. And that's one of the reasons why there's such a great flee to Hawaii, is because it's beautiful, and people can avoid the truth and the discomfort of the panorama, the panini, as Laura calls it, right? But we see this mass exodus happening, particularly with, and without getting too into it, like anti-vaxxers, right? Where people flee to Hawaii or to Mexico, and they can pretend like it doesn't exist. And these isolated places where people who are indigenous to those lands are really being harmed. Are you, with all of that, are you still seeing more people that are like waking up and showing up, or like, what's your perspective?
Oh God, it's so rough. Just yes, to all of that. I mean, to be honest with you, like it's, and I'll get specifically to the answer to your question, but I have to say that, my choosing to leave the yoga industry and to stop teaching was largely because so much harm had been inflicted on me. I felt really through the rhetoric of and the push to spiritually bypass real pain and real experience, and to sublimate what the very human elements of our nature into some idea that we can be something better if we aren't honest and if we don't feel. And it's so profoundly fucked up. And it's so profoundly damaging to any kind of liberation movement because, as we know, it cuts off the truth. And so, it disallows the truth. And so while on the whole, I do think that, yes, in the wake of the uprisings of 2020 and this sort of current civil rights movement that has been resurrected, I think, yeah, on the whole, there's more awakening within white communities. And at the same time, I had in 2018 and 2019 become really disenchanted with, I started a blog in 2012 and I never intended it. I didn't even know what a blog was. I never intended it to become a business. It did. I'm very grateful for it. It afforded me, the platform that was built out of it afforded me the opportunity to build my career as a writer and to publish books, I'm thrilled about that. But what happened was I got folded into sort of the influencer industry and making money on Instagram. And by 2018, I was really over the pressure of having to, deal with metrics in order to please sponsors and in order to keep content safe enough, AKA apolitical enough, which is impossible. I don't believe that that's possible. In order to appease whatever, capitalist sensibilities ruled the day. And I essentially just got to a point where I was like, I can't do this anymore. I've built this platform on myself. If I am lying, not that I was ever actively lying, but in any form, through not talking about something that feels not talking about, racism or white supremacy because I want to appease a potential advertiser, it feels sickening to me. I can't do this anymore. And so I started to shift away from that. I had always been very vocally political in the writing I did on my site, on my blog, but often I would tone that down for Instagram. And so I was like, you know what, I'm done. 2018, I'm done with doing that. And in 2019, I helped create this influencer inclusion rider that I was based off of the Hollywood inclusion rider that came out of the Time's Up movement. And I specifically put out a call for white creators to implement this inclusion rider, which is an add-on to a contract that basically says to, whomever the company is, these are the principles that are important to me. I am signing on to do this work with you with the understanding that the other people that you are hiring, include this number of diverse populations and identities. And if these quotas aren't filled, then I'm asking you to make X donation to X organization. But before even using that, there was like a process that I started to use and I shared with other white creators, which was, hey, have this conversation with, the second a business initiates a conversation with you, ask them who else is on this campaign. Because what I saw was I was being invited on all kinds of trips and things and whatever. And it was like a bunch of white ladies. And it was awful. And so that was 2019. And what I saw was that nobody was that into what I
No.
was doing.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, they were sort of like, yeah, this is great. And there was a little bit of momentum around it.
Mhm.
But you just like think back, like rewind, you know, pre 2020 to what it was like.
Yes.
And then you know, I had a business agent at the time that, you know, helped me get deals. And within like 6 months or so of my sort of saying, I'm not going to hold back anymore, they dropped me.
Mhm.
And I was losing, you know, tons of followers. And I was also just like, cool, like I will find a way to make money. And again, this is speaking from, you know, speaking from a place of privilege where I've pretty much always been self-employed. And so I'm really like very vigilant about squirreling away money when I have it, because I'm like, you never know when or where it's coming next. And so, you know, I felt like, okay, I just, if I have to, you know, figure out other ways of making money, if I go back to ghostwriting or, you know, doing copywriting and copy editing, fine. Like I would rather do that than be muzzled. And then 2020 and the pandemic and the, you know, gruesome murder of George Floyd and the social justice uprisings that ensued. And within that first week, I was getting about three or four calls and texts and emails a day from white women in the, you know, wellness or blogging or influencer industries who suddenly felt like they needed to make public statements.
Mhm.
And for some gross and inexplicable reason, thought that I would be the person to like give them whatever stamp of approval they needed to make a statement about something that, you know, they a few months ago couldn't be bothered with. And it was so upsetting to me. And yet at the same time, there was also the very clear desire for Black and Indigenous women of color not to have to do the labor of educating white women at this juncture. And so I was like, okay, like, sure, we can talk about this. Like, I'm happy to do that, but understand that like, I'm also a white woman. Like I can only advise you from the perspective that I have. And that was really, you know, and a lot of these people were people who I had gone to before and said, hey, you know, you have this podcast. I notice you know, you're not talking to any Black women and very few women of color. Like, can I please introduce you to this list of people? And it was like, well, we've tried.
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, but now, because if you don't say anything on Instagram, you're going to get fucking canceled. Now you want help.
Mhm.
And so I feel a little bit like, I think that it's important. I've actually spoken about this with Rebecca a lot because I was so disturbed by it when it was happening. And something that came up was, I think that it's easy for, well, first of all, it's easy for me as a white person who doesn't have, you know, where my body is not actively on the line, for me to like comment and just have sort of high level thoughts about this at all. And so I feel very sensitive to that in general. I also think that that it's easy to, in moments of cultural upheaval and political change, dismiss those who are just entering into the stream of the work, without taking into account that there is always a place, a starting point for everyone, and that it may be very messy, and that it may look very gross and not feel good, and that it doesn't mean that it won't ultimately yield something of value and true co-conspiratorship and true advocacy. But it's hard to, like, it's really hard to know and to trust.
Wow, you said so much in there that I feel, because we've been speaking to the to most BIPOC people. You're probably the only one of two white-bodied women that we've spoken to out of many. So it's so interesting to hear your perspective and your experience with this, because a lot of the work that BIPOC people want white people to do is to listen, is to build resiliency, is to consistently show up and do the work themselves. And I think what you just explained really painted another picture, for me at least, of why they don't even want to open that Pandora's box, right? It's because, first of all, your financial life might be on the line. You might lose followers for speaking up. You might have to actually address your own internalized racism. And then you're going to fuck up and people are going to call you out and you're going to look dumb. And I think showing up, even though you're going to look dumb or that people might call you out, I think that's why people avoid this kind of work. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think it's really something that if you haven't been in conversation around these issues, I see for other people, and particularly white people, that it feels or seems almost impossible. And so they think, well, it's just easier not to. And I say, I always recommend Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy workbook, because, and it's funny because often I'll recommend it and then someone will say like, oh yeah, I need to read that. And I'm like, it's not something you read. You have to do it. And it's really getting in at that level, but people don't want to do that. They don't want to do the work. And I think a lot of it is confusing and it is confronting. And it is a kind of, I think there's no way that, like, it strikes me as similar to, it's an aspect of absolutely of like moving towards liberation, but also of really deeply understanding oneself. And like anyone who has even remotely ever considered like therapy or anything like that, like this work it's the same material of getting under the skin of identity and self-knowledge, and looking at where we have walled off parts of ourselves to the world and to the communities that we're a part of, and why. And I think it's so, especially at this moment where everything is at risk, sociopolitically, economically, climatologically, like our planet is fucking falling apart. And if we can't be bothered to really deeply take a look at why and how we have cut ourselves off from each other, how are we going to make it? Like, we're not.
Mhm.
We need each other.
It's interesting because as you're speaking, I'm thinking to the fact that there is a general frustration with white supremacy, but specifically with white women amongst BIPOC communities, because there's this special place of power and privilege and also oppression that we all have in common. And yet it seems like many white women specifically will stand with white supremacy in order to maintain that tiny bit of leverage and privilege without realizing, like, and we look at, like, even the way that, this is an odd and perhaps inaccurate example, but affirmative action covers white women as well, because women as a collective are oppressed in every society, pretty much, in every Western society at least, and many non-Western societies as well. And so, and again, I know you can only speak to your experience, and you can only speak to the experience of someone who seems to be pretty self-aware for, like, and have been for doing this work for a long time. So I don't know that you necessarily will have the answers, but what have you observed, and how, what can we do to get through to people so that they understand that white supremacy negatively impacts literally everyone, including white men, and like negatively impacts everyone. It is like this spiky, uncomfortable thing we're all holding up, and we're all bleeding, but no one's willing to let it go. And so, like, what do you think that we can do that would sort of appeal to our target audience?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think that the siloing of that occurs as a result of white supremacy, the segregation, the way in which the centering of whiteness, it creates this like magnetic field around whiteness, such that everything else is sort of like pushed. It's like a reverse magnet. And in a way, that reverse, that pushing out of all other life, so that whiteness can be protected at all costs, and the illusion that whiteness is somehow, as you said, Brittany, like it's somehow doing us all a favor, when it's actually just completely destroying our humanity at its core from the inside out, this lie of whiteness and white supremacy, that breaking down that force field that keeps everything else out and that perpetuates that lie, by being able to understand that our community is bigger than what, and I'm speaking for myself and for people in communities that are comprised of predominantly other white people, that the more that I can see my interconnectedness with communities beyond my own, and the way that, for example, and I know I keep bringing this up, is because it's a lot of the work that I do, but climate change and climate crisis and this code red for humanity is coming for everyone. Like it is, it's an intersectional affair. Like there is nobody left out, and
except Jeff Bezos.
That's right. Well, and he just bought land on Maui.
I can't.
Oh my God, stop. No.
I literally get chills when he bought land on Maui, include oceanfront, including a Native Hawaiian fish pond that, it's just.
Oh, he's just like the world's penis head, like, and he literally looks like one. I'm sorry. I know that's not very mature, but I just. I can't.
But so, for people to stop being willing to accept this lie that we can exist and survive without each other, and that we can somehow ignore what's happening around us because it feels easy and good, to be willing to look at what is actually happening on the land where I live. Who is affected by this? Who is, outside my front door struggling?
Mm-hmm.
What is actually going on in my community? And not to come in with some kind of, fucking white savior complex and like, well, now I know better, so I'm going to figure all of this out for everyone. But to come in and say, who can I talk to? Who can I learn from? Who knows what's happening in my community that I don't know?
Mm-hmm.
And what can I learn from them? And what can they show me about building a true community where I live? What's needed? How can I leverage the resources that I have access to get that done?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more, and often that starts with feeding people, because at base that really is something that is just, it's like the most basic thing. But along with healthcare, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But even that, like, do you know where your food comes from? Do you know how your food gets to your house? Who are the people along that, supply and labor chain? What does that look like? What does it mean that you're so disconnected from the source of your food that you don't even think about how your food gets to your plate? What would happen if everything shut down, as it inevitably will for all of us at some point in the wake of climate disaster? What are you going to do? We got a taste of that during the pandemic with supply chain disruption. But it's like to willfully ignore the fact that we are so profoundly interconnected is insanity at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can accept our connectedness, then the kind of prioritization and the sort of potent illusion of white supremacy that is deeply affecting all of us starts to crumble, because it doesn't work. As you said, it doesn't work for anyone, including all of the cishet white men. Like, they're not going to be out like dancing in the freaking category 6 hurricane.
Well, some.
Yeah, some.
Oh my gosh. Well, you have such a beautiful Instagram, and I love your food posts. And if I can just say that I feel you being so connected to the land that you grew up on, and being connected to the people of it, I really believe it helped you almost channel these energies and help you discover more about yourself and how you move through this world. I think it's not an accident that you had that experience and now you're speaking to us today here. I really do believe you are so needed, and I'm so glad that you started speaking out and sharing your truth and your experiences on your Instagram, because I was showing Brittany your page and I'm like, she's like she's one of those like revolutionary writers, but it's so beautiful. It's done so aesthetically.
Thank you.
Because at first glance you're like, oh, this is aesthetic, but then you read it, you're like, oh.
Yeah.
That's so sweet. Thank you. Yeah. Well, a little bit of sweetness with the punch never hurt.
Yes, exactly. But you also have a journal with your co-creator, your, it sounds like mentor and friend. It's a journal called What's Your Story? And on your website, you write transformational writing prompts for personal and global change. Is that also a way for you and for all of us to journaling as a way to create change?
Yeah, absolutely. The work of What's Your Story it came out of my experience as both as a student in Rebecca's Art of Memoir course, and then assisting them and us really witnessing people have these incredible transformations and wanting to sustain them beyond the time span of the course itself, and realizing that fundamentally one of the things that is so hard for us, and this absolutely goes back to everything we've been talking about, and I think Brittany is another answer to the question that you just asked me, is it's really hard to be honest with ourselves. And have just been going through a breakup, and I was talking with a friend about it, and she was saying, something that is so difficult about being human is that we're often the last one to know something about ourselves. Like our friends can see it, everybody else can see it, but like we ourselves, we have we have blind spots often to ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so these questions are designed to remove those blinders and to give us access to those spaces within ourselves that maybe we can only access when we are when we're questioned in the right way. And I think being able to tap into, what is the narrative I'm telling about myself in this particular area of my life? Where did it come from? When did I first start thinking this? And how did it take hold? And what does it do on a daily basis to be holding this narrative as the dominant thread of identity? And whether it's about work or about our bodies or relationship or our spirituality, and then to sort of disentangle all of those pieces enough that we can step back and say, okay, I think I'm ready to write a different narrative for myself in this arena, and here's what that might sound like. And so certainly, the book is designed, and there's even it's organized by the chapters go in the flow of sort of the circadian rhythm of a day, but there are also color coded sections through the book, so that you can, if you want to just focus on activism and politics, for example, you can follow one particular color code throughout, or grief, loss, and the work of healing, or spirituality, or self-care. So it's very multi-purpose in that way.
I love this.
Yes, thank you. That's like such beautiful work, because if we can also do that for ourselves, we can all co-create a new story for our collective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the aim very much is, and something that Rebecca and I really focused on as we sort of went into the virtual tour spaces. Okay, we are massively in this moment of rewriting the story of America, and it really is up to us. Like it, and I mean, to the degree that it can be, barring all of the insane systems that we live within, but
yeah.
but we do what we can.
They've like barricaded the truth, and like they won't let you get to it.
That's right. That's right.
Can I ask you, what work do you think that white-bodied people have to do?
Question whiteness.
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
I think that's really, for me, like, there's this, again, this fundamental misunderstanding, this lie of whiteness. And I think it's not taken as a lie. It's not taken as a misunderstanding. It's not taken as something that was invented in order to perpetuate systems of oppression. And so, to question it, to dismantle it, I think that from there, everything else kind of unfolds.
It's the thread that
Yeah.
makes everything unravel.
That's right.
I
Wow.
love that.
Damn.
I don't think you realize how, Lily, how you can create visuals with your words. Like
Yes.
everything you say, I'm like,
excellent. I'm glad my work as a writer is translating verbally today. It doesn't
is.
always go that way.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Lily. I adored this conversation. I was actually going to make a joke, but I prevented myself from going there because I tend to do that. But I really hope it wasn't the Bumble guy that you're breaking up from.
No. Oh my God, no. I never saw him again.
Okay. Because I was like, red flags.
No, that was a one and done situation.
But thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. We'll link everything down below in the show notes. Thank you so much, Lily.
Yes, thank you both. It was just a pleasure to spend an hour chatting with you, and thank you for the work that you both are doing. I'm really grateful for the space that you create for contemplation and education and revelation.
Thank you.
Yeah.